David Barney, a physicist working at CERN, said, "It's quite amazing, really. We never expected this to go so quickly. We're incredibly pleased. Everything seems to be working excellently. The LHC hasn't actually accelerated particles yet. It hasn't made them go any faster than they were when they came into the tunnel. CERN intends to collide them at higher energy next week." This is back in November, which would make this early December. "It's going incredibly well, and we don't really know what to expect next." So this is certainly a fantastic phenomenon to follow. The Large Hadron Collider is an amazing experiment happening on the Franco-Swiss border in Geneva, underground, 100 meters, smashing protons and particles together to see if we can look way back in time, in essence a time machine, to the beginning of the Big Bang, and ascertain what exactly happened, how the Big Bang was created. Lots of other things are a byproduct of this experiment. Particles called strangelets can actually be created, which are, in fact, basically miniature black holes. So matter and even light could be sucked into this thing, as some people think, pulling the Earth into the strangelet itself, and along with, the other stars and planets in our solar system, and eventually possibly our galaxy. Wow, you know what I mean? So there's a lot of interesting things happening there. The chances of that, from what I read before, are something like winning the lottery. So it is entirely possible that strangelets could gobble up the Earth. Moving on now, I want to go to Popular Science here. It's called the Martian Torture Chamber. This comes from Popular Science, like I said, posted on the 2nd of November of 2009. Earthly organisms undergo tests in Mars-like conditions. First of all, let me point out that I love Mars. Everything about it. I don't know, I've always been fascinated with the planet. Have you? I mean, it's in legends and mythology, and I always had this weird feeling that that somehow Mars had been populated before. And for us to go to Mars would be really incredible, because it would give us a chance to, if we could fund it properly, bring archaeologists and geologists and go there and see if they could find any structures on the planet. Certain people like Richard Hoagland thinks that there are structures there, as well as on the moon, which just fascinates me. I did a project in high school. Actually, it was junior high, and I made it to the regionals because my project was on the terraformation of Mars. And this kind of came post Total Recall, starring one specific governor that really, really fueled my love of Mars. Anyway, getting back to this Martian torture chamber. In Berlin, in a basement, sits a small torture chamber. The air inside the hermetically sealed steel chest consists of a choking 95% carbon dioxide, some nitrogen, and some traces of oxygen and argon. The pressure within is 1/170th that on Earth, and the thermostat is set to minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit. In other words, a nice afternoon on Mars. Experiments at the facility regularly subject some of Earth's hardiest creatures to this hell, and they do just fine. This August, several dozen scientific institutes combined the forces to test a variety of Earth species in Mars-like conditions, identifying life forms that can survive on another planet, what mechanisms they use to do so, and what byproducts they leave behind will give scientists a more specific idea of what to do or what to look for when searching for ET, says Jean-Pierre de Vera, a biologist at the German Center for Aeronautics and Space Research, or DLR, where most of the experiments are carried out. At press time, the scientists had tested Deinococcus radiodurans, a bacterium known for its radiation tolerance, Xanthoria elegans, a lichen that thrives in Antarctica and low oxygen conditions, and Bacillus subtilis, a comparatively ordinary bacteria found in soil around the planet. Quote, "I was astonished that organized symbiotic communities such as lichens, which consist of fungi and photosynthetic algae or bacteria, can survive," De Vera says. After 22 days, 80 to 90% of the lichens were not only alive, but active. It seems that complex life-giving processes can happen off-planet. For one thing, De Vera says, this is the first evidence that organisms might conduct photosynthesis on Mars. Next, he plans to investigate whether methane-producing bacteria, which could account for Mars's methane clouds, can make it on the planet. That from Popular Science in November of 2009. Fantastic. Do any of you remember the space rock? It was actually a meteorite, or a meteor that had landed in the Arctic? Up north? That looked like it had fossilized microscopic life on it, like little worms? Well, that kind of reminds me of this story. It is entirely possible that life exists on Mars. And according to some people, like Andrew Basiago, for instance, it does exist and has existed and continues to exist on Mars. Next up on the Unified Field, we have the Audio Zone with Jessica Schaub's interview with Andrew Basiago. Remember last week we could only hear half of the first segment. We're going to listen to the rest of it right here on the Unified Field. This is the Audio Zone. Now, if you remember last episode when we listened to this interview that Jessica Schaub did with Andrew Basiago, his father, when he was a very young boy, I would assume 8 years old, came home after drinking with his army buddies, and he was laughing and carrying on about this paper that he had read about a discovery of life on Mars. And he was about to share with Andrew Basiago, his son, who the writer was, I believe, and when that paper was from. Here it is.
He gathered us around. He said, children, join me in the living room. I have something very funny to share with you. And he said, this is what this guy has written about the first discovery of life on Mars. And he was reading it as if it was maybe a comedic essay or opinion editorial out of a newspaper or something like that, kind of a Swiftian essay in which the conceit of this work of literature was that somebody was describing for the first time life on Mars. And what he was reading, I now realize, because I've written the paper, was a summary of some of the most fanciful, even farcical passages from my 2008 paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars. Now, this was 40 years before the paper was written. And he found, it's clear to me that the passages that were taken from the paper in this particular incident seemingly must have been passed along to my father to deceive him or to only partially inform him about what's in my paper. I mean, I wrote the paper in a way in which I would prove that Mars is inhabited, and I would write a solid work of natural history that would contain as much evidence as I could to prove my major premises of the paper. But in some portions of the paper I wrote, for example, when I was naming life forms, or I was describing some of the ground drawings that are found in NASA image PIA 10214, which was taken from the westward, from the western edge of the home plate plateau, looking westward in late 2007, and then posted on the World Wide Web in 2008. So in some portions of my paper, I wrote in a Swiftian way. So, for example, people would enjoy reading the paper, but but also that, for example, so that children could identify